The envelope had been sitting in my grandmother's Bible for 31 years, and my father threw it in the kitchen trash without even opening it. I watched him do it. I was 9 years old, standing in the doorway of our kitchen in my church dress, still holding my little white purse. We had just come back from my grandmother's funeral. The house smelled like casserole and carnations, and relatives I barely recognized were filling every room, talking too loud the way people do when they're trying not to cry. My grandmother, my father's mother, had pressed that envelope into my hands right before we left for the church. Not my father's hands, mine. "This is for you, sweetheart," she'd said. Her voice was very quiet. "When you're older, you'll know what to do with it." She passed away 3 hours later, before we even got back to the house. I didn't open it. I don't know why. I just held it the whole way home, this small cream-colored envelope with my name written on it in her handwriting. Olivia, just my name. No last name, no return address. Her handwriting was so neat it looked like a font. When we got home, my father was handling everything. The calls, the food, the relatives, the logistics of being the oldest son. I set the envelope on the kitchen counter while I went to change out of my dress. I thought I'd come back for it. I was gone maybe 10 minutes. When I came back to the kitchen, my father was wiping down the counter. The envelope was gone. I looked around. Checked the table. Checked the chairs. "Dad, did you see the envelope Grandma gave me?" He glanced over his shoulder at the trash can, then back at the counter. "That little thing? I threw it out. Probably just a sympathy card she made up, you know how she was." I stood there. I was 9. I didn't know how to say, but she gave it to me. She said it was for me. She made a point of it. I just said, "Oh." He turned back to the counter. That was the end of it. I fished through the trash after he left the room. I found it between a paper towel and a coffee filter. It was a little wet at one corner. I dried it on my shirt, slid it into the front pocket of my jeans, and carried it upstairs to my room. I put it in my sock drawer underneath everything else, and I didn't open it. I know how that sounds, but here's what you have to understand about my father. He had a way of making you feel like anything you cared about was slightly embarrassing. Not through cruelty exactly. He wasn't a yelling kind of person. He was more of a dismissing kind of person. And when he dismissed the envelope, something in me decided that if I opened it and it turned out to be nothing, just a card, just a note, then I would have been wrong to care. And I couldn't handle being wrong in front of him, even privately. So I left it sealed. I left it sealed through middle school and high school. Through the years, my father sold the house I grew up in and moved us into a newer, colder one. Through the years, I learned to shrink myself a little in every room my father was in. He wasn't a bad man in any dramatic way. He just had very strong opinions about what mattered and what didn't, and his opinions were law in our house. My interests didn't matter much. My feelings were soft and therefore suspect. My grandmother, who had been gentle and specific in the way she loved me, was referred to after her death as eccentric, said with just enough of a smile that I knew I wasn't supposed to admire her too openly. The envelope stayed in my sock drawer. When I went to college, I packed it in a box. When I moved into my first apartment, I put it in the back of my nightstand. When I got married, it came with me. My husband, whose name is Owen is the kind of person who notices things without making a production of it. About 2 months after we moved into our house, he was helping me organize the nightstand, and he found the envelope. He held it up. "What's this?" I told him the whole story. He listened the way he always listens, which is completely, without interrupting. When I was done, he turned the envelope over in his hands. It was still sealed. 31 years. My grandmother's handwriting. "Do you want to open it?" he said. "Not yet," I said. He nodded and put it back without another word. That's Owen. The thing about my father is that he was always very good at being owed something. He'd done well for himself over the years, built a small real estate investment business, owned several properties, knew the right people in the right rooms. He had a talent for positioning himself as the person who had sacrificed most, worked hardest, given the most. And because he told that story so consistently and so confidently, a lot of people believed it. I believed it for a long time. My grandmother, I came to understand as I got older, had not believed it. She and my father had a complicated relationship. He loved her, I think, but he also managed her, the way some people manage difficult situations, always maneuvering, always positioning. She'd been widowed young, had her own money from my grandfather's insurance and from the house she'd sold after he died, and my father had been her financial advisor by default for most of her adult life. Helping her, as he called it. A few years after she passed, I overheard my father on the phone with his accountant. Something about a property transfer that had happened before the estate settled. I was home for Christmas, 22 years old, standing in the hallway outside his office. I didn't understand all of it, but I remembered it, the way you remember things that don't fit. I opened the envelope on a Tuesday night in February. No particular reason. Owen was working late. I'd had a normal day. I'm a physical therapist, so my days are physical and specific and leave me tired in a clean sort of way. I came home, made dinner, sat on the couch, and for some reason I went to the nightstand and I took out the envelope. I sat with it for a while, then I opened it. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper and a small key on a plain ring, the kind of key that opens a safe deposit box. The paper was a letter, dated about 3 weeks before my grandmother died. She had known. In the letter, she explained that she had opened a safe deposit box at a bank in her city, a branch of First Federal Savings, about 90 minutes from where I now lived. Sometime in the mid-1990s, she had placed several items inside, documents, and a separate sealed envelope which was only to be opened by me. She wrote that she had made arrangements for the box to be held long-term, with the annual fee prepaid for 30 years through a separate account, and that I was the named access holder. She said she didn't want to explain everything in the letter because letters could be found. She said that when I was ready and when the time felt right, I should go to the bank and I would understand. She signed it, "With all my love and more faith in you than you probably know, Grandma June." I sat on the couch for a long time after that. I didn't call my father. That part was clear to me. Very suddenly, with a certainty I couldn't quite explain. I didn't tell anyone in my family. I texted Owen, "Can you come home? Nothing's wrong. I just need to show you something." He was there in 20 minutes. We drove to the bank on a Saturday morning. First Federal Savings, a branch in Millbrook, a town I'd never been to, in a low brick building next to a dry cleaner and a nail salon. I had the key and the letter and my ID. The branch manager, a woman in her 50s whose name tag said Cheryl, looked up the box number and then looked up from her computer with an expression I couldn't read. "This account has been in our system for a very long time," she said. "Yes," I said. "I know." She made a copy of my ID and had me sign 2 forms, and then she walked us back to the vault herself, which I didn't expect. We went through the heavy door, and she used her key, and then I used mine, and she pulled out a long metal box and set it on the table in the small private room. "I'll leave you to it," she said. She closed the door. I opened the box. Inside was a manila folder, a second sealed envelope, smaller, with my name on it again in my grandmother's handwriting, and underneath everything a spiral notebook with a faded floral cover that I recognized immediately. It was the notebook my grandmother used to write her grocery lists in when I was small. I used to sit at her kitchen table and watch her make lists in it. I opened the manila folder first. It took me a few minutes to understand what I was looking at. Owen read over my shoulder, and he's much better than I am at parsing legal documents. "Olivia," he said quietly, "look at this date." The folder contained the paperwork for a trust. My grandmother had established it in 1993, the year I was born. Named beneficiary, me. The original trust principal had been funded with $85,000, proceeds from the sale of the house she'd shared with my grandfather, the house my father had always said she'd sold at a loss, and that most of the money had gone to cover expenses. Included with the trust paperwork was a separate brokerage statement, a more recent printout that had been placed in the folder. I could tell because the paper was less yellowed than the rest, and when Owen read the number on the brokerage statement aloud, I made him say it again. 7 years of growth on an original $85,000 invested conservatively in index funds through an account my grandmother had set up independently through a financial advisor who was not my father. Current value, $418,000. Not $12 million. Not a fortune that changes everything in a movie kind of way. But more than I had ever had. More than I thought was possible. More than my father had ever once suggested existed. I sat down in the chair in that little room and I just breathed for a while. Then I opened the smaller envelope. My grandmother's handwriting again. She explained that after my grandfather died, my father had helped her handle the estate. He had been helpful, she wrote, in many ways. But she had noticed over time that certain amounts didn't match what she'd been told. A property sold for less than she later found it had sold for. An insurance payout that seemed smaller on paper than what the policy had specified. She wasn't a sophisticated financial person, she wrote, and she hadn't wanted to cause a family rupture over something she might have misunderstood. But she had quietly, over the course of several years, moved what she could of her own money somewhere safe. She had done this with help from her own advisor, a woman she'd found through her church, someone my father didn't know. She had not told anyone. She left the trust for me specifically, she wrote, because she had watched me and she thought I was the one who would know what to do with it. Not because I was the cleverest, because I was the one who stayed quiet and watched. Quiet people see more than the loud ones think, she wrote. I know you. You'll figure it out. At the bottom of the letter, she had written a name and a phone number, the financial advisor who had helped her set up the trust. Still practicing, as far as she knew at the time of writing, I held the letter against my chest, and I thought about the woman who had pressed a cream-colored envelope into the hands of a 9-year-old girl in her church dress and said, "When you're older, you'll know what to do with it." She had been right. I didn't do anything dramatic. That's the part that surprises people when I tell this story. Owen and I drove home and we made sandwiches and we sat at the kitchen table for about 3 hours. We went through everything methodically. We called the financial advisor whose number my grandmother had left. She was semi-retired but still reachable. And she remembered my grandmother immediately. She had been the one who'd placed the most recent brokerage statement in the folder about 2 years prior, when she'd done a routine check-in on the account. She told me she had always wondered if anyone would come for it. Your grandmother was a very careful woman, she said. Yes, I said. She was. We retained an estate attorney named Patricia, who came recommended by Owen's colleague. Patricia reviewed everything: the trust documents, the brokerage statements, the original funding paperwork. The trust was clean and legal and entirely in order. Because I had been a minor when it was established and the trust had specific language about distribution at the time of my grandmother's death, upon my reaching adulthood, the funds were mine. There was no question. Patricia also noted, without my asking, that the discrepancies my grandmother had described in her letter, the property sale, the insurance payout, were potentially actionable. She said it carefully, the way attorneys do when they're handing you something heavy. She said she wanted me to understand my options. I said I'd think about it. I thought about it for almost 2 months. During those 2 months, my father called me 3 times. Normal calls. How are you? How's work? How's Owen? The kind of calls we had always exchanged, surface level and regular as utility bills. I talked to him like everything was normal. I was very good at that. I had been practicing since I was 9 years old. In one of those calls, he mentioned that he was thinking about retiring soon and consolidating some of his holdings. He mentioned in passing that he'd always felt bad about having to handle so much of the family's finances alone over the years. He said it had been a lot of responsibility. He said he hoped I knew how much he'd sacrificed. I said, I know, Dad. I hung up and sat in my car in the parking garage outside my office for about 10 minutes. Then I went back to work. Owen is not a dramatic person either, but he has a background in accounting and a very specific gift for documentation. Over the 6 weeks after we got back from the bank, he quietly and systematically went through every piece of financial information we had access to. My grandmother's old bank statements, which Patricia had helped us obtain through the estate records, property sale histories that were public record, the insurance company's archived payout documents, which required a formal records request but were retrievable. He built a spreadsheet. He printed it out and handed it to me one night after dinner. He didn't say anything. He just put it on the table in front of me and went to do the dishes. The spreadsheet showed, line by line, the gaps. Not accusations, just numbers. The amount recorded in estate records versus the amounts in public transaction records versus the amounts my grandmother had documented in her own notes, which had been in the spiral notebook, the floral-covered one, her grocery list notebook. It turned out she had been keeping track for years, quietly, on the backs of pages, in her neat handwriting that looked like a font. She had seen everything. I gave the spreadsheet to Patricia. I want to be careful about how I describe what happened next. Because it wasn't fast, and it wasn't clean, and it wasn't the kind of confrontation where someone sweeps into a room and says something devastating in front of a crowd and everyone gasps. Real life doesn't do that. Real accountability is slower and more paperwork-based and a lot less cinematic. Patricia referred us to a forensic accountant who confirmed the discrepancies. The numbers were significant, not in the realm of criminal fraud that sends someone to prison in a dramatic headline, but significant enough that Patricia said we had a very strong civil case for breach of fiduciary duty and misappropriation of estate funds. She filed the claim on a Wednesday afternoon. My father's attorney called mine the following Monday. I had told my father nothing. He found out from the filing. I know because his attorney's first call to Patricia included the phrase, "My client is shocked and deeply hurt," which Patricia relayed to me with the kind of neutral expression attorneys use when they're trying not to have an opinion. My father called me that evening. He was not yelling. He was never a yelling person. But his voice had a quality I hadn't heard before. Tight. Controlled in the way of someone who was very frightened and working hard not to show it. He said he thought there must be some misunderstanding. I said, I don't think there is. He said he had always done his best for the family. I said, I know you believe that. He asked if we could sit down and talk about this before it went any further. I said, I think it's already gone further. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, and I've thought about this sentence a lot since. He said, I didn't think your grandmother would have done something like this. And I said, I know. That's the thing about her. You didn't see her coming. I hung up. I sat on the edge of the bed, and I realized I had been waiting to say that for a very long time. Not those exact words, but something like them. Something that said she outmaneuvered you from the grave, and I was the one she trusted to carry it out, and you spent 30 years dismissing both of us. The settlement came 9 months later. I won't give you the exact number. What I'll tell you is that it covered the discrepancies Patricia had documented, plus interest, plus legal fees. It was enough to matter. It didn't make me rich. It made me whole, which is actually a more complicated thing. My father paid without it going to trial. I think he knew what a trial would mean for his professional reputation, for the business, for the way people in his circles thought of him. He paid, and in the settlement agreement, there was language that said neither party would disparage the other publicly. I agreed to that language, so I won't tell you he's a bad person. I'll just tell you what happened. What I'll tell you is that I have the floral-covered notebook on my bookshelf now. My grandmother's grocery lists are in it. Eggs, bread, orange juice, those thin wafer cookies I used to eat at her kitchen table. And behind the grocery lists, in her handwriting that looks like a font, the years of quiet record-keeping. The evidence she gathered because she trusted that someday someone would use it. I think about her a lot. I think about the version of her that existed before I was old enough to really know her, the woman who figured out, slowly and without fanfare, that someone she loved was taking from her, and who did not explode, did not confront, did not create a scene, who just quietly, methodically built a protection around what she could protect. Who chose one person to carry it forward and spent 30 years being right about that choice. Quiet people see more than the loud ones think. I have the trust money in an index fund. Conservative, long-term, the same kind my grandmother chose. I'm not doing anything dramatic with it. I'm not quitting my job or buying anything flashy. I added it to our retirement accounts, maxed out our contributions, put a portion in a high-yield savings account. Owen calls it the patience dividend. He said it like a joke, but I've been thinking about it as a serious thing. The return on 31 years of saying nothing, of keeping a key in a nightstand, of trusting the person who trusted you. My grandmother gave me that envelope when I was 9 years old. My father called it trash. She knew something he didn't. She knew that the things people dismiss are sometimes the most carefully constructed things in the room. She knew that a quiet girl in a church dress, standing in a kitchen doorway, was watching everything. She was right about me, and I went to the bank and I opened the box, and I finally understood what she'd been trying to give me all along. Not just the money, not just the documentation, not even just the justice of it. She gave me the proof that I had been seen by someone who mattered, before I knew how to see myself. That's the thing I'll hold on to longest. I keep thinking about the grocery lists, not the trust documents, not the brokerage statement, not even the letter. The grocery lists in that floral notebook: eggs, bread, orange juice, those thin wafer cookies, and behind them, in the same neat handwriting, years of quiet record keeping that nobody knew existed. My grandmother sat at her kitchen table and wrote down what she needed from the store, and then she flipped to the back pages and wrote down what was being taken from her. She did both things without fuss, without drama, without telling a single person. That's the part I can't stop sitting with, because it would have been so easy to do nothing, to tell herself she'd misunderstood the numbers, that she wasn't sophisticated enough to know for certain, that starting something would only cause pain. Most people would have made that choice. It's the easier choice, and nobody would have blamed her for it. But she didn't make that choice. She made a different one. Slower, quieter, more patient. And it required something I think people underestimate. It required her to know the difference between keeping peace and accepting wrong. Those are not the same thing. She was a gentle woman, but she was not a passive one. She understood that integrity isn't just about how loudly you object. Sometimes it's about what you do in private, when no one is watching, when there's no audience and no reward for doing the right thing. She built something true in the dark, and she trusted it to hold. And then she trusted me. That's the part that still gets me. She looked at a 9-year-old girl in a church dress and made a decision, not based on any proof yet. Based on something she saw. She saw that I was watching. She saw that I was the kind of person who holds things carefully, who doesn't throw away what she doesn't understand yet, who will sit with something long enough to figure out what it means. She bet 31 years on that, and I think about what it would have meant if she'd been wrong. If I'd opened the envelope as a teenager and tossed the key, or lost the letter in a move, or just never gone to the bank. All of it would have dissolved. Her quiet years of documentation, her careful planning, her faith in me, gone. I didn't let that happen. Not because I was brave, because I was stubborn enough to carry something I didn't understand, and patient enough to wait until I did. I think about that when people talk about resilience like it's dramatic, like it requires some visible act of courage. Sometimes it's just not throwing things away. Sometimes it's keeping a key in a nightstand for a decade, because something in you says, not yet, but not never. Owen built the spreadsheet. Patricia filed the claim. The system worked the way it's supposed to, slowly and with a lot of paperwork. My father paid, not because karma reached down and balanced the scales in some cosmic way, but because my grandmother had done the methodical, unglamorous work of documenting the truth, and I had done the methodical, unglamorous work of following it forward. The outcome came from the work. That's how it actually goes. I'm not rich from this. I'm not transformed. I go to work on Monday mornings the same as before. But I have the notebook on my shelf, and sometimes I take it down and look at her handwriting. She saw me before I saw myself, and she left me everything I needed to become someone worth seeing.